Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Pat Furlong from PPMD, and this is our 1 p.m. Wednesday webinar, which you might be very familiar with. Today, we're joined by our good friends from NS Pharma, Randy McGonigal and Ben Yungher. Randy is the Director of Market Access for NS Pharma. He's been leading the creation of the NS Support Program, which is going to assist patients, caregivers, and providers to deliver the company's access service programs. Randy also manages the field-based team responsible for payer interactions and site of care support. The mission of the team is to reduce barriers to access to vitilarsen therapy for patients and caregivers. Randy joined NS Pharma in October of 2019, and Ben is NS Pharma's MSL for the Northeast U.S. with a doctorate in neuroscience from the University of Miami. He has specialized there in gene therapy and nerve regeneration. In addition, we're joined by Dr. Barry Byrne. Many of you have probably heard of Dr. Byrne. He has done so many things for the Duchenne community to include this study and many others, and he'll be joining us for a Q&A. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Rachel Schrader, who will be leading the webinar and moderating. Rachel, it's over to you.
Thanks so much, Pat. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're excited to have a really great conversation about the recent approval of VILTEPSO for the treatment of Duchenne muscular dystrophy amenable to exon 53 skipping. I think we're going to have some really great content and questions and hopefully provide some clarity to the community as we look forward to this additional approval within the Duchenne space. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Ben. As Pat said, he is an MSL with NS Pharma, and he'll be able to provide us with some great insight about the indication and some other data points about VILTEPSO. Ben?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Hi, everyone. Grateful to have the opportunity to be here with you all. Thank you to the Parent Project. We're always excited to engage with the community and speak with you all. I'm happy to be here to talk about VILTEPSO, which is our recently brand new FDA-approved treatments for patients with Duchenne that are amenable to exon 53 skipping. And I apologize in advance for reading this page, but it's important, so let's talk indication. So VILTEPSO is indicated for the treatment of Duchenne in patients who have a confirmed mutation amenable to exon 53 skipping. The indication is approved under accelerated approval based on an increase in dystrophin production in skeletal muscle observed in patients treated with VILTEPSO. And continued approval for the indication may be contingent upon verification and description of clinical benefit in a confirmatory trial. So some safety information, the warnings and precautions. In clinical studies, no patients experienced kidney toxicity during treatment with VILTEPSO. However, kidney toxicity from drugs like VILTEPSO may be possible. Serum cystatin C, urine dipstick, and urine protein to creatinine ratio should be measured before starting and during treatment with VILTEPSO. And consider measuring the glomerular filtration rate before starting VILTEPSO. The most common adverse reactions include upper respiratory tract infection, injection site reaction, cough, and fever. So I imagine there are a lot of questions. I'm happy to answer them. I'm going to be presenting the following 4 objectives. But yeah, as questions, as you think of things you want to ask us, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A portion on your screen. So first, I'm going to talk about some background about Duchenne, and specifically, what is exon skipping? How does it work as a treatment for DMD? Next, we'll talk about the efficacy, so how effective is VILTEPSO? And the third is I'll talk about the safety profile of VILTEPSO. And then my colleague Randy, who's our Director of Market Access, will review the patient services available for VILTEPSO. So we have people that are working hard now to make it as easy as possible for patients to get access. Okay. So DMD is a rare pediatric neuromuscular disorder that affects about 1 in 3,500 live male births. And although rare, it's the most common form of muscular dystrophy. Patients experience a progressive decrease in muscle function, a loss of ambulation, respiratory failure, cardiac dysfunction, and premature death. DMD rarely affects girls, and there it's usually milder than in boys. And currently, unfortunately, there is no cure for DMD. The treatments that are available are palliative. They help to make it better, but they don't target the molecular cause of the disease, and they may lead to adverse side effects. So some examples of current treatments are steroids, which reduce inflammation, respiratory care for lung function and physical therapy for muscle, and ACE inhibitors and beta blockers to improve cardiac function. And here are the average ages for Duchenne patients that symptoms are first noticed, the disease is diagnosed, and loss of ambulation occurs. So VILTEPSO is a new FDA-approved exon 53 skipping antisense oligonucleotide for Duchenne. It's studied in children as young as 4 years. So let's start with this image. So in a healthy gene, you have about 30,000 genes in your body, and many of them are composed of portions called exons. And the exons fit together just right. They're spliced from RNA. And you can see here these jigsaw puzzle pieces. They're kind of a representation of what we call a reading frame. And in most of your genes, they fit together just right. And you have this tower that is balanced. In Duchenne, there are mutations that sometimes lead to a missing exon. So you can see if you are missing this exon, the rest of the tower is no longer balanced, and it'll fall over. So that means everything downstream to the mutation is lost. So Duchenne is caused by the lack of the dystrophin protein from the dystrophin gene. Now, the purpose of exon skipping, by skipping one additional exon after the deletion, after the mutation, we've shortened it a little bit further, but we've restored the balance. So the blue part fits onto the green part, and the tower, the gene, the product, is shortened, but it contains the essential functional portions. So about 8% of patients with DMD are amenable to 53 skipping. And some examples of the deletions include exon 52, or 50 to 52, or 49 to 52, etc. And VILTEPSO is a once-weekly, 80 milligram per kilogram dose, a 60-minute intravenous infusion for the treatment of DMD in patients amenable to 53 skipping. All right, so how effective is VILTEPSO? So the efficacy and the safety of VILTEPSO was studied in multi-center clinical trials in boys with DMD. So we have two studies, study 1 and study 2, where we looked at a total of 32 boys, 16 in each, and we compared different doses. We used a short placebo-controlled safety period and measured the dystrophin levels from muscle biopsy 24 weeks after initiation of treatment. So the study endpoints here were safety, tolerability, and dystrophin protein production. There were other secondary outcome measures, including the mRNA levels, some immunofluorescence, and some motor function tests. In Japan, study 2, the phase 1/2 trial, again, 16 boys looking at 2 different doses, and the primary outcome measures were dystrophin protein. So who were the boys included in this study? So in study 1, on average, the boys were about 7 years old, but as young as 4. So this is the first time that dystrophin protein was measured in exon skipping as young as 4 years old. And the baseline of weight, height, and body mass index were comparable between the 2 different dose groups. The majority of patients were white, with 1 patient being of Asian race. And the other inclusion criteria, I'm going to talk about the data from this trial, but the boys that were included in this clinical trial were male patients confirmed to have a mutation amenable to 53 skipping. Ages were 4 to less than 10, able to walk independently and able to complete these functional assessments, and importantly, a stable glucocorticoid dose for at least 3 months. VILTEPSO treatment induced dystrophin expression to nearly 6% of normal in study 1. So treatment for 24 weeks with the approved dose, 80 milligrams per kilogram per week of VILTEPSO, led to an increase from a baseline of 0.6% to 5.9%. Again, just after 6 months, 24 weeks. So this is the average of the patients. We can look at each of them on this next slide. And you can see all of the boys that received this 80 milligram dose group, all of them increased their dystrophin protein levels, and 88%, which is 7 of the 8, increased dystrophin levels above 3%. So in addition to just the total amount of dystrophin that was induced by VILTEPSO, we also confirmed that there was an increase in the number of muscle fibers that were now dystrophin positive. So this is an immunofluorescence image, and you can see that the dystrophin protein localizes to the correct part of the cell. So it co-localizes with these muscle membrane indicators, laminin and sarcoglycan. So there were significant increases in the number of muscle cells expressing dystrophin. So that was the effectiveness. Let's talk a little bit about safety. So the most common adverse reactions that were reported included upper respiratory tract infection, reactions at the injection site, cough and fever, etc. But importantly, there were no serious adverse events related to treatment, no discontinuations, and no deaths. How does VILTEPSO work? VILTEPSO is given as an 80 milligram per kilogram weekly intravenous infusion, and the dose is calculated based upon patient weight. And it takes about 60 minutes for infusion by a healthcare professional at home or at a treatment center. So to summarize, this now approved VILTEPSO treatment for patients amenable to 53 skipping, 100% of patients who received VILTEPSO increased dystrophin levels from baseline. The safety profile was evaluated in a robust 24-week clinical study, and the IV infusion can be administered at a treatment center or at home. I'm going to pass things off now to my colleague Randy McGonigal, and thank you for your time.
Very good. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Ben. As Ben mentioned, I will be introducing you all to the NS Pharma Access Support Services Program. Before I get to the Access Services Program, I think it would be a great idea just to introduce you all to who NS Pharma is. By introduction, NS Pharma is a wholly owned subsidiary of a company called Nippon Shinyaku, which is based in Kyoto, Japan. NS Pharma is a sponsor of the phase 2 studies that Ben went through, in addition to a phase 3 trial which is underway. Our focus in the U.S. with NS Pharma is in orphan rare disease. So as Ben talked about VILTEPSO, we hope that is the first of many product launches soon in the United States. Our parent company, Nippon Shinyaku in Kyoto, is founded almost a little more than 100 years ago, 1919. The four areas of corporate focus have been drugs and rare diseases, urological, hematology, and diseases in gynecology. So I want to bridge now over to the NS support platform. So NS Pharma has developed the NS support program with dedicated case managers to help patients and their families and healthcare providers to obtain benefit investigation services like copay support and information about product administration in a variety of sites of care. That can be a hospital outpatient department or even home infusion. To introduce the NS support team, the NS support team consists of customer service representatives, case managers, and field-based directors of patient access. The NS support customer service representatives are available Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And we wanted to open this window of time up, basically 12 hours, to accommodate patients and their families throughout the United States. Each patient in NS support will be assigned a personal case manager. The case manager has extensive knowledge of insurance plans. They are the ones that are actually conducting the benefit investigations. The case manager will be the family's go-to person to help manage access, reimbursement, and care coordination initiatives. And just as each patient and family will have their own case manager, the healthcare provider in their practice, the offices, will be assigned a dedicated field-based director of patient access. The field-based director of patient access is an experienced veteran professional who can provide physicians and office staff with access and affordability support. To highlight the support services, once NS support receives a completed patient start form, and I'm going to outline the start form in a few minutes. Once we receive a start form from the physician's office, NS support will provide rapid benefit investigation and verification. We'll be conducting the benefit investigation and producing the results within 24 to 48 hours after receiving the initial form. Prior authorization assistance and exceptions and appeals information will also be provided. However, this will be done by the research that we garner from the benefit investigation. We'll provide that information to your physician, and NS support will not fill out any of the medical information that requires the judgment of the prescriber. So that basically the letters of medical necessity, we will give the physician guidelines, but it's up to them to complete the information and send it into the payers to obtain authorization. NS support will also explain benefits and copay costs to families. We'll do that in a welcome call. We'll offer insights about infusion site of care options and provide ongoing support, which includes follow-up calls throughout the patient journey. So this starts with our welcome call after the benefits have been verified with your insurance company. I know that cost of medication is very important to any family. And whether a patient has commercial health insurance or government-funded health insurance through Medicaid, CHIP, or a combination of plans, or even a patient has no insurance, NS support is there to help families find ways to make treatment more affordable. We have options to help patients to minimize the out-of-pocket costs and reduce the barrier of access, which is out-of-pocket costs for each family. To continue on affordability options, if patients have no insurance, we offer a patient assistance program. Today, this application with terms and conditions can be found at the VILTEPSO.com website. So we'll provide information about how we'll support uninsured patients, and we can even provide information about independent foundations and additional programs that may benefit patients. I mentioned earlier, there's a start form. So the start form can be found also at the VILTEPSO.com site. So when a patient start form, and this is really needed for every patient, when it's received by NS support, we'll conduct a benefit investigation and determine eligibility into all the NS support assistance programs. This form needs to be completed by both the provider, the doctor, and the patient's family. So once this gets sent in, we go to work to help inform and reduce as best we can the barriers to access. In summary, NS support will provide comprehensive care coordination for patients, caregivers, and healthcare providers. With NS support, you'll be able to reach a case manager 12 hours a day, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern. The phone number, you see it there, is 833-677-8778. And we are very excited to start beginning to receive these start forms to help patients. This concludes the presentation portion.
Great. Thank you so much, Randy and Ben. I think that was a lot of really incredible, helpful information for everybody on the phone. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and transition to a moderated question and answer session. We have a handful of questions that we've already received from the community in advance of today's webinar, but we also have a chat box function through the ReadyTalk platform. So if you look at the left lower hand corner of your screen, there is an option to type in a question, and then we can go ahead and work through those as they come in. So please feel free, ask your question. Don't hesitate. There's no silly question. So if you've got questions for either Randy or Ben or for Dr. Barry Byrne, we're happy to dig through those. So I think one of the first questions that we'll dive into is really a theme that we've seen from the community as we think about patients getting onto VILTEPSO treatment, and that really pertains to the washout period. And if a washout period would be required for a patient who is perhaps switching from Vyondys to VILTEPSO, and does that washout period become necessary from a safety perspective, or even from a payer and insurance requirement? So I think maybe, Ben, we can start with you and then jump to Randy, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start just by saying that patients that have a mutation that is amenable to 53 skipping are eligible for VILTEPSO. As for the how to switch from another exon skipping treatment, we don't really have that data, so we cannot make a recommendation to the how. So what I can recommend is that you speak with your healthcare provider, your neurologist, and they'll be able to have a discussion with you based on your individual situation.
So before Randy jumps in, I want to ask Ben, I'll say we've got a lot of clinicians on the phone that are prescribing the drug. So I guess one of the questions is, if we're deferring to our physicians to make this call, are there any resources to support them or help them, procure that baseline knowledge so that they can safely make that switch for their patients? And maybe, Barry, that's the question that you could help us address as well.
Yeah, I can comment that in our own experience with eteplirsen, for example, where there's a longer time frame to deal with different providers and insurance plans, it's very individualized. So as was just said, it's just really going to have to be any discussion, either initiating therapy or any changes in therapy or adding this to other therapies, are going to be dependent on the individual plan of the insured patient. So I wish there were a generic approach to this, but it is very individualized at the moment.
Sure. Thank you for clarifying. And then, Randy, I'll toss it to you.
Yep.
But it is good to
sure.
highlight that there are best practices that are often shared among providers that I think is a benefit to the patient community, that those be made available to anyone who feels that they would learn from common elements of a letter of medical necessity, for example, and eligibility criteria.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, that's actually a good segue. I think whether a patient is new to VILTEPSO therapy or switching from another medication, the process of obtaining authorization at the insurance level is going to basically be the same. So you're going to have to go back to your treating physician, and a letter of medical necessity will have to be submitted into the health plan. Based on their criteria, they will issue any type of approval. So for us, it would be initiating through the START form. We'll do the verification of benefits and find out any specific requirements that the health plan would have.
Sure, that makes sense and is incredibly helpful. Thank you, Randy. So next up, we've got a question in regard to variability in dystrophin expression on Western blot. So there was a figure toward the beginning of the presentation in your slides, Ben, that showed the different participants within the trial and a pretty wide range in that level of dystrophin production. Could you speak to that variability? Do we have any theories as to why there's so much variability? Does it have any relation to specific genetic mutations? Any insight you could offer us there?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a lot of variability. We present the average of 5.9% of normal expression, but yeah, there's quite a range. And most likely it's because of the variability inherent to Duchenne. It's a very heterogeneous population. So as for the individual patients, I can't really speak to those characteristics that may lead to differences in dystrophin expression. Unfortunately, we don't have a good answer for you there.
I think, it's tough, right? Because it's certainly something that we wish that we understood better, but you're absolutely right. This definitely is a variable group, even though they are all amenable to that exon 53 skipping agent. So I think we're all anxious to see what that looks like as we learn a little bit more, and perhaps that's something that we'll see in that phase 3 trial as well.
Right. Ultimately, we want everybody to have as much dystrophin as possible. But what we can point to is the 88% value that ended up above 3%. So certainly we're thinking the more is better, but these results are pretty promising.
And just to clarify, do you have any data that sort of delineates expression based on different mutation groups?
No, we cannot point to the individual mutations and expression rates.
Okay. All right. Let's see what else we have here in our questions. So here's one regarding cardiac expression. So this is a two-parter. The first being, do you see cardiac expression with treatment of VILTEPSO? And then the second part of that question, we've heard a bit from the community that some families are a bit confused because they're hearing that maybe Sarepta's drug reaches the heart, whereas NS Pharma's does not. And I can see how that would be really confusing as a parent. So maybe, Ben, you could start, and then Barry, you could chime in with any additional insight you have on cardiac data and expression.
Yeah, I can start there. So in our clinical trials, these study 1 and study 2, we did not look at cardiac expression of dystrophin. So I cannot guess. I can't make any assertions about how it affects cardiac tissue.
Sure. Barry, would you add? Do you have any insight from your own experience that you could add to that conversation?
Well, in the included age groups for these studies, there are generally few, if any, measurable baseline abnormalities. So any effect on cardiopulmonary function would only be measured at later time points as the cohort progresses against a natural history. data that would deviate from the natural history, and so that takes many years to collect any of that information. So cardiopulmonary function is affected importantly by two aspects. There would be direct effects on myocardial dystrophin expression, which haven't been observed in other similar compounds. Only other formulations, such as the PPMO formulations, have had a very dramatic effect on myocardial expression. But there's also important to consider the accessory respiratory musculature and the diaphragm, how that contributes to heart function. So as respiratory function declines, there's additional work for myocardial function and output based on the work of breathing. And so when there's benefits in pulmonary function, there can be secondary benefits in particularly right ventricular function, which there's an interplay between the function of the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And it's an interesting process that's been well observed in other forms of cardiomyopathy that are related to congenital heart disease. When there's right ventricular volume overload, this impacts LV function, and the twisting function of the left heart is impeded by that, and that ultimately would be detrimental in patients with Duchenne. So we can hope that over time, that this aspect is studied in more detail through both natural history studies and studies in the treated patient population, that those benefits will be identified.
Great. I think that's really important background, and I know it can be really confusing for families. So, Dr. Byrne, I think that was quite clear and incredibly helpful. So thank you for that additional insight. All right. So the next question that we have, I think this one might be a bit tricky to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because again, this is a common one that we're seeing from the community, and also submitted today here on this webinar. But can you speak to the difference between Vyondys 53 and VILTEPSO? Then maybe you can start us off.
Sure. So it's a little tricky here. There are some things that I can't say. I'll mainly focus on what VILTEPSO is. So VILTEPSO is an antisense oligonucleotide. It's a PMO, phosphorodiamidate, and it's a 21 oligomer antisense oligonucleotide. So that's what it is at its basic. I can't really speak to the difference between them because there have been no head-to-head studies between VILTEPSO and any other exon skipping therapy. So all I can do is reiterate the 5.9% dystrophin expression seen after 24 weeks of the 80 milligram dose group. Fortunately, I can't tell you more than that.
Dr. Byrne, would you add anything to that from your own clinical experience?
No, there's really no additional data other than that, the assessments of dystrophin expression differ, and so it becomes very hard to make direct comparisons unless those were all done under common methodology. So it may be very difficult to assess that in a post-marketing environment where patients are receiving clinical product. And there's in general not an approach by providers to do a post-treatment biopsy to assess the level of expression. Most providers will rely on clinical outcomes, which are obviously quite important and go beyond the surrogate measure of dystrophin levels. So that again will be dependent on collecting real-world data across a variety of mutations. As was noted, there's tremendous variability, both in functional assessments at baseline in the patient community, as well as the nature of the mutation that makes it amenable to 53 skipping. As you saw from the presentation, there are a variety of mutation types that can be impacted by this approach, even including mutations in exon 52. So until there's more experience, it will be very difficult to make any direct comparisons.
Sure. I think as a community, we understand that it's just so hard to really compare the two head to head, but at the same time, I think it's probably one of the biggest questions that we're all asking, particularly as families consider either which drug to pursue or whether or not they should switch and what that looks like. So I think we're all really looking forward to seeing additional data as it becomes available, and continuing to inform that conversation. So the next couple of questions I'm going to field to Randy as they pertain to sort of that access space. So the first question is in regard to the cost of the drug. So can you speak to the specific cost of the drug and what specific assistance or outreach will occur to ensure that the drug gets into formularies for both medical facilities and providers and insurance companies?
Yeah, sure. So I'll address the last part first and then go backwards if that's okay. So from an insurance company standpoint, in the pre-launch phase, we were able to get our clinical message out to the insurance companies so they are aware of the medication. Now that it's on that's been approved by the FDA, our job is to obtain approval from a formulary perspective. And, we also have a team that will do the same, our field-based team in the hospitals and institutions. Now, from a cost perspective, obviously a very important question. And, the cost of the medications, while it varies based on the number of vials given because it's a weight-based dose, what typically doesn't seem to vary much is your out-of-pocket costs. And I think that's so important to families because oftentimes we all have a fixed copay. Many times for commercial payers, that maxes out, anywhere from 10 to maybe 12,000 or more per year. And those are, serious, financial considerations for families. And on the federal side, Medicaid, et cetera, the out-of-pocket costs are there too, not necessarily as high as sometimes that we see on the commercial side. But the support services, I think, are really important to minimize the cost for families. And on a commercial standpoint, if people are eligible and they have commercial insurance, we enroll patients into our copay assistance program. We're going to do everything we can to minimize those out-of-pocket costs for the drug. On the public payer side, we're able to refer patients to assistance, whether that's a foundation or other places, to seek assistance in overcoming some of those out-of-pocket burdens. So on the commercial side, direct control from us, and I think we've done a really nice job of coming up with a fantastic program to remove some of those barriers for people.
That's fantastic. I think, any additional resource that we're able to provide families at all is just always really very much appreciated. And then my second question for you, Randy, can you speak to access to drug outside of the U.S.? So I recognize this is a U.S. approval, which is really, really great. Are there any mechanisms in place for, the rest of the Americas, Europe? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say that I work in the commercial organization in the U.S., so I really don't have a line of sight into the activities outside the United States in gaining approval. So I'm probably not the right one. Ben and I work in the U.S., so the two of us won't be the right ones to ask on that. And we can refer any of those questions to our corporate office for response. But I could field questions on the U.S., and that's about it. Apologies.
I appreciate the transparency, though, so thank you for being able to point us in the right direction. So any families who find themselves in this situation, please reach out directly to NS Support or even reach out to us here at PPMD, and we can always facilitate a connection to really look into your unique individual circumstance and what's available to you. All right, so let me see. Let me look at this Q&A chat and see what other questions we've got coming in. There are definitely quite a few of them. So this one is actually in regard to some other types of technology as far as Duchenne replacement goes. So maybe, Ben, you could speak to the difference in effectiveness and or safety between exon skipping therapies versus microdystrophin.
Yeah, sure. No, that's a great question. I'm been following the gene therapy options. I think it's really interesting. We're trying to get treatments to as many boys as possible, and we're hoping to bring VILTEPSO to as many eligible patients as possible, but that's not going to be for all patients. So we welcome any gene therapy that could provide clinical benefits. That would be a really welcome development to see. But these potential gene therapies that we're seeing are still years from being commercially available, and the damage caused by DMD is progressive and irreversible. Not all patients are going to be eligible for gene therapy, and not all of them are going to respond to gene therapy. And we don't really know yet the long-term duration of response. So all I can say is right now we're committed to getting VILTEPSO to as many patients as possible as quickly as possible.
Certainly, absolutely. And another question I'm going to field to you, Ben, in regard to muscle biopsy. So the timing of muscle biopsy is earlier in the NS study as opposed to maybe some other studies that have taken place previously. Are you confident that dystrophin increase plateaus by week 24, or do you suspect that there is potential increase in dystrophin production past week 24? Right.
Whether that's possible. So what I can say is that there's no data. So we, just to reiterate, we measured dystrophin levels by muscle biopsy at week 24 of treatment, which is pretty early. We're pretty pleased that we saw these results as early as week 24. What would have happened if we repeated muscle biopsy at a later time point, I can't speculate. But what I can say is that we have a currently ongoing phase 3 trial, not one that is going to look at dystrophin production. So muscle biopsy is not everyone's favorite technique. So we're really focusing on confirming the functional outcome, the benefits to muscle function. So our phase 3 will be looking at that at a longer time point, week 48 weeks of treatment. So I can't say for certain what will happen to dystrophin levels beyond week 24, but for now we're going to try to focus on function.
And then can you clarify, is that biopsy that we see in the study, was that needle or open? I presume that was open?
I'm going to have to get back. I'm not certain, so I don't
Yes, the biopsies were done in the bicep muscle, the upper arm.
Biceps. Okay, great. In regard to that phase 3 trial, can you just clarify the ages that are included within that phase 3?
Yes, thank you. So our phase 3, which is currently enrolling, the inclusion criteria include an age range of 4 to less than 8. And if you want any more details about the inclusion criteria for that, it's available on clinicaltrials.gov, and you can search for Zolta-Larsen or Racer 53, which is the name of that trial.
And are there any plans to look at pre-ambulatory or non-ambulatory subjects?
This is a common question. It's a great question. So for boys that are preambulatory or non-ambulatory, right now we have that in discussion, and if we have any developments, we will make that publicly available as soon as possible.
Great. We look forward to that. I know that that's something that we all think about quite often. What about these little itty bitty guys, and what about our older guys who would definitely benefit from, this additional information, data about upper limb strength. So we appreciate that. And then in that same vein, as we look to future studies and additional data, I'm aware that we have the Exon 44 skipping agent in Japan, and I believe that's a dose-finding study. Could you speak to just what that program development looks like, when we might see that in the U.S., if there are any plans for that, anything you could share with us there?
I don't have too much to share for you on that, but as you mentioned, we do have an early clinical study going on with our partners in Japan for exon 44 skippers. We don't have any plans yet to bring it to the U.S. Obviously, that'll depend on the results of those early clinical trials. So I hope that we can bring that over and get more patients treated. I couldn't give you specifics on that.
Hey, we had to ask, right? All right. So my next question, I know we're kind of jumping around into different wheelhouses, but the next is in regard to functional and strength endpoints. So were there any trends towards benefit observed in function or strength endpoints? I know the primary outcome was looking at safety in that Western blot, but we would love to have some additional insight from that functional perspective if you are able to share.
Yeah, it's a little complicated. Like you said, the primary outcome was dystrophin production and safety and tolerability. We did look at function as a secondary outcome, and it's some of that data is available, published data. I can't really speak to it because it's not in the label. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't really point to the function from our phase 2, but I'll remind you that all the participants in our phase 3 are going to be involved in that study to look at the improvement of function over 48 weeks. So hopefully we'll get that confirmatory study to show functional benefits.
Perfect. That's a great clarifying point. So thank you for that. As you mentioned the label, this next question is actually in regard to that label. Our understanding is that this is a pretty broad label. Are there any age exclusions for treatment on commercial product? And do we know if there's any benefit for the older non-ambulatory guys? So I know we already kind of dove into that piece, but maybe you can speak to any age exclusions for commercial product.
Right. So in the label, there is no age exclusion. I'll remind you just because why not? Our clinical trials age range, phase 2 was 4 to less than 10. The Japanese phase 1/2 was 4 to less than 18. And our phase 3 will be 4 to less than 8. So our label does not mention age. And I don't know if I can say much beyond that. Randy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, there are some payer policies. It's not consistent, but there are some payer policies to gain approval and authorization for really all of these medications. Many times they put the study criteria as a requirement. So if there's an age requirement on some of the payer policies, it reflects what the study criteria entry point was for age as well. So it's sort of every health plan is different in this situation.
Sure. And I would imagine, Randy, that's probably where your team will come in as quite helpful in helping families and clinics really navigate what that looks like and, optimize access for families. So
that's correct.
We're super grateful that you and your team are available to support the community. So thank you for that. All right. So a quick scientific question for you, Ben. Hopefully this is an easy one. What is the half-life of VILTEPSO? And is there any consideration in the future, so this part may be a little less straightforward, any consideration to dosing more often than every week?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. First of all, Rachel, thanks so much for moderating. You're doing a great job. These are all really great questions. I appreciate you giving them to us. So for the half-life of VILTEPSO, I can say it's on the order of several hours. It's excreted in the urine pretty quickly, so it's gone within a couple of days. The effects may last longer than that, but the viltelarsen molecule itself has a half-life of several hours. For dosing changes, so I can't really speak to that. The label, the FDA approval was for a once-weekly intravenous infusion. Yeah, that's really all I can say about that.
Okay, sure. I know we're giving you really tough questions, so I appreciate you answering as best you can given the limitations. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate it. So in that same vein, can you speak to how long, so we know there's a relatively short half-life, but as we know from other sorts of therapies, the half-life doesn't necessarily correspond with efficacy, right? Or how long that drug expresses. So could you maybe speak to how long we think it remains sort of in the system to actually provide increased dystrophin production? I'm trying to word that carefully for you.
You can word it as carefully as you want. That's probably a little too tough for me to answer here. We do have our early clinical dose finding studies. I can't really speak to that. But like I said, the once weekly infusion is what's approved by the FDA.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I do appreciate that. All right. So let me see what other questions we've got here. So this next one is good, and maybe this is a Randy question. I'm not sure. But the question is, do you have any educational programs or resources for physicians as they are navigating this new approval and how to potentially, I hate to say it again, potentially choose between drugs? So what sort of resources are available for the physicians who want to learn more about VILTEPSO? We'll leave it at that.
Yes. Yeah, sure. Well, we certainly have our medical colleagues and a medical hotline to get data. I think soon we will have our field sales organization that'll be calling on physicians to educate them on the benefits of VILTEPSO. There's also our field-based, as I mentioned earlier, directors of patient access that are dedicated to calling on the offices and addressing questions from an access standpoint. So I think we have a comprehensive way to educate the doctor, whether it's on the product itself or how to access a product and get approval at the payer level. Beyond that, anything that's outside of the sales or market access standpoint would be really our medical colleagues to field the rest of those conversations.
And just to add on to that, my opinion, I've been speaking with a lot of physicians, and everyone that I'm talking to is incredibly well informed about the options in Duchenne. So they all have that baseline of understanding. But if there are any questions, either from families or from physicians, we have you can start by emailing us at info@nspharma.com or reach out however you'd like.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Any insight on when you might be able to share functional data? I know it gets a little bit tricky with the type of approval and with the phase 3 trial, but I know that that's something that the community is really looking forward to hearing. I think we're all really excited about this approval and what it means for the community, but that's definitely, I think, one of the next questions that we're all looking to. So any rough timeline on when we might be able to hear a little bit more about that?
Rough timeline. I can tell you that, the duration of our phase 3 trial, that's RACER 53, the duration will be 48 weeks of dosing and some follow-ups. So we're currently enrolling. We've begun enrolling our patients in that phase 3 trial. So once that last patient is enrolled and screened, it'll be 48 weeks, and that data will be accumulated. So that's the rough timeline that we can give you.
I think that's really helpful. And then just to clarify for my own knowledge and for, I'm sure other people are curious about this as well. So that phase 3 RACER, that is placebo controlled. Is that correct?
That's right. It's double-blind, placebo-controlled study. We have about 10 sites in the U.S. and I think about 30 worldwide. So it's a global phase 3 trial. We're hoping to enroll 74 patients.
74. Okay, that's really, really helpful. Excuse me. I think, one of the questions that families that are considering VILTEPSO might have is what are benefits to maybe enrolling in the trial where they may or may not get placebo versus going on commercial drug? Can you share any insight on benefits to joining that trial, both short-term and long-term, if you're able to speak to that? No,
that's another good question. So the benefits to joining the trial, obviously, we're using this. We are required to do this trial so that we can look at the functional outcomes. We really want to understand the effectiveness of VILTEPSO on function. So the benefits would be joining that effort. Beyond that, I think it's a discussion with your healthcare provider to discuss your individual situation.
Sure. And then can you clarify, not necessarily where the sites are, but where families could go to learn if there is a site near them that might be a good option for them? Where could they get more information?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, this information is found on the clinicaltrials.gov website. So again, clinicaltrials.gov. That's the U.S. government site. And so that will list the study locations. So there's one in Arkansas, California, Colorado, etc. So you can find the closest one to you and, again, speak with your physician about possibly joining. And again,
absolutely.
You can search
and then a
for
quick plug.
Larson or Racer 53. Sorry about that.
Absolutely. No, you're fine. I think we're on the same track. I was just going to add that for those of you who are enrolled in the Duchenne registry, if you're part of that registry, you'll also get email notifications if you become eligible for a trial. So that's a really great resource to receive notifications about, inclusion in Racer 53 or in other clinical trials. So if you're not already in that registry, we would encourage you to do that. You can go to our website and follow a pathway to get signed up for the Duchenne registry. So lots of great benefits to that, and we certainly want to use that as a mechanism to increase access to clinical trials for those who are interested in participating. I think that about does it in regard to all of the questions. I know that we've received a ton of questions from the community through today's webinar. Some of them have been easy to answer. Some of them have been really, really challenging. And so I just want to say thank you to Ben and to Randy and Barry as well. I think that you all have done a phenomenal job trying to tackle some of these questions that we have and understanding what this approval means for us and for the community. I can say that we're all just so incredibly excited and thrilled to have another approval in the Duchenne space. This is a really great thing for us. And we're excited to see, the results of Racer 53 and the potential 44 exon skipping agent. We hope that moves forward quickly. We're just really, really thrilled to have partners in the NS Pharma support team. So thank you for joining us today. And then I also just want to thank everybody that called in to listen in. So thanks for taking an hour out of your day to join this conversation, ask your questions, hear a little bit more about VILTEPSO. This will be available for playback on the website if you would like to go back and listen to it again. And if you have additional questions, shoot us an email. We're happy to connect you with either our genetic counselors here at PPMD if you've got questions or the appropriate folks at NS Pharma. So feel free to send us emails. I know our emails are available on the website. You can shoot me an email, rachel@parentprojectmd.org. I'm happy to talk through any questions you have. So with that, I will say thank you again to everyone, and that concludes our recording. Thanks, guys.